back to the Holy Smokes podcast. For our first episode, we've brought on Tristan Jacobs, who has been spending the past couple of months with his research into different conceptualizations of the divine within biblical tradition and how these ideas of gods, angels, and demons evolve over time. Thank you so much for coming on, Tristan.
Thank you very much for having me on.
For starters, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
No problem. I'm a third-year student at the University of Groningen, and I'm doing a minor in anthropology where I have been working on a research project with a focus on the anthropology of religion and more specifically, biblical scholarship surrounding, as you said, conceptualizations of the divine and how we understand the nature of deity. I myself was raised Christian and have, as just about anyone else in predominantly Christian nations, been exposed to all kinds of ideas around the nature and appearance of God, angels, and demons, from the frescoes in the Vatican to Jim Carrey movies where God looks suspiciously like Morgan Freeman. And during my engagement with critical scholarship of biblical literature, I was presented this incredibly rich tapestry of traditions and beliefs that made me wonder where these ideas come from. So that's what my research has focused on, the nature of God. Sounds really dramatic, but I think is a lot more fun than it might sound.
Well then, let's throw you straight in at the deep end and start with a question people have asked themselves for millennia at this point. What does God look like?
That's a very good question and a somewhat difficult one to answer, maybe. First and foremost, it is important to recognize that the Bible, neither in the New nor the Old Testament, is univocal. That is to say, it does not speak with one unified voice, it does not present one consistent perspective on any one issue, including what God might look like. In fact, there are numerous parts of the Bible that contradict each other in their representation of God. If we look at the very first book of the Bible, I think we can see a rather poignant example of this. Most scholars agree that we have two different and distinct creation accounts in the first three chapters of Genesis. One that is running from Genesis 1:1 up to the first half of Genesis 2:4, and then another one that runs from the second half of Genesis 2:4 until the end of chapter 3. This might actually come as a bit of a shock to some people who really only know the story most of us have heard of, the good old "let there be light" and on the seventh day and so on. But in reality, Genesis 1:1, starting with the famous "in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," which incidentally is actually itself a mistranslation of the original Hebrew, but maybe we can get into that on another episode. Genesis 1:1 is most likely a later tradition than the creation account that follows after. And they both tell a different story about the process of creation and the God that is doing the creating. That second account from chapter 2:4 onwards is one of a very anthropomorphic deity. They make noise as they walk through the Garden of Eden. This is a deity that creates manually by manipulating the soil. It's one that interacts directly with their creation. And it is also one that seems to kind of be recalibrating or fixing their creation as they go on. Many scholars believe that centuries later, the priestly authors, so these would have been cultic authorities, people that had authority over the temple or institutions of worship, who would have been associated with the state, with the king, and so on, they came through and sort of updated things, making changes where they saw fit. This would have probably been during the period of exile, in the absence of access to the temple and these institutions of worship for ancient Israelites. This priestly tradition seems to envision a more transcendent, a more abstract deity. They create by divine fiat, by speaking things into existence. The account is sort of interacting with, responding to, and to an extent combating different creation accounts that were circulating around ancient Babylon at the time, while also updating what's going on in that older tradition. So while the deity from chapter 2 creates with their hands, the one in Genesis 1:1 doesn't. While the deity in chapter 2 has just sort of fixed their creation, they create the human, but then go, that's not quite right. Let's make some animals. Maybe, need something more. Let's make the woman. Well, that's happening in chapter 2. In Genesis 1, everything is created and God saw that it was good. It's all correct right from the beginning. Here we also have this separation of creation into the 7 days, where on the 7th God rests. This might be boring from the sevenfold division of days that was common in Mesopotamia around that time period, but it might also be a way for the priestly authors to demarcate a sort of a sacred time in the absence of a temple, which would have been a sort of sacred space. So we might not have a temple to structure our worship, so let's pick out a specific day to structure our worship around. All this is to say that these changes to the creation account and to the perception of God were a sort of response to the conditions, the realities, and the circumstances that the people the authors are writing for are facing while in exile. This change away from the concrete, the anthropomorphic, the tangible God towards a more abstract, transcendent deity is one that carries on throughout the Bible and in history in general. The earliest depictions of the God of the Bible show him as having a wife named Asherah and children, as looking essentially like a human, at best just a very big human. Today you would be hard-pressed, I think, to find practicing Christians that conceptualize the God of the Bible in this way. Most Christians you would ask on the street would probably tell you that they imagine God as pretty much entirely abstract, as being this intangible mythical force that resides within all things, or something along those lines at least. Scholars have argued that this abstraction of deity over time coincides with society and institution becoming more and more complex, more and more abstract as well. So as you move away from small pastoral societies towards increasingly impersonal networks of social, economic, and political organization, the society's conceptualization of divine power and how it is enacted also becomes less concrete, less human in a way.
Now that's interesting to me because you were just talking about how creation had to be fixed or corrected. To someone who was raised with the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient God, that might seem strange. Is the God of the Bible really all powerful, all knowing, and all good?
Another great question, and luckily one that is maybe a little easier to answer. No, there was no universally agreed upon doctrine of omnipotence throughout the composition of the Hebrew Bible. God's power was represented in situationally emergent ways. In other words, you represented God's power in response to questions that arose or in trying to explain the past. And you can imagine that there were cases where it's rhetorically useful to represent God as limited in his power, especially when accounting for past events where bad things happened. If God is on our side, why did we lose that war? Why didn't he stop this catastrophe, And a simple example of this could be Judges 1 verse 19, where they tell the story of Judah, who, with God's help, went to conquer all the hill country, but didn't manage to conquer the valley because they had iron chariots. So it seems that here God is either presented as unable or unwilling to conquer the valley because of those iron chariots. But I think there's actually a cooler example in 2 Kings 3. Here the narrative is about a coalition that forms between Israel, Judah, and Edom in order to invade the kingdom of Moab and engage in essentially kind of scorched earth campaign to functionally destroy the nation as punishment for throwing off vassalage to Ahab's son Jehoram. This is something we actually have extra biblical attestation to in the form of the Mesha inscription, which is a fascinating artifact in itself, but ultimately Moab obviously continued to exist and wasn't destroyed. This is a reality that the authors of Second Kings obviously had to kind of contend with and explain. Why did the prophetic promise of the destruction of Moab by a Yahwistic prophet in the text not come true, right? The text goes on to talk about how the coalition under the guidance of God was successful in their campaign until they get to the last city, where the Moabite king is now cooped up, unable to push out the invaders and about to lose, when in verse 27 it says that he offered his son and heir as a sacrifice on the city wall. And the very next sentence in the text states that there was great fury against Israel. They got up and left. It's maybe a little anticlimactic, which honestly is a bit of a theme in many of these biblical traditions, most of which really aren't a particularly thrilling read for modern standards, I think. But clearly the campaign was ultimately unsuccessful, being forced to retreat. And that language of fury that Israel faced in the text is only ever used to talk about divine fury, within the Hebrew Bible narratives at least. So most scholars agree that ultimately the sacrifice worked and catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who then drove out and defeated the invading armies with their god. So essentially, the author of this chapter can account for the fact that they got away by saying, well, Yahweh invaded another nation, just lost home court advantage, and then the other team won. There's a way of acknowledging reality, that Moab wasn't ultimately destroyed despite the prophecy, while preserving the theology and worldview of the authors. This may sound weird to people today who conceptualize God differently, but in the ancient world, your God just couldn't win all battles. Not everything was a home run, and ultimately you need a way to explain when that happens. And frequently that meant that God was simply defeated. Another interesting thing to mention is that prior to the exile, the biblical authors thought of God's sovereignty on earth as limited to the nation of Israel. Prior to the exile, all nations were thought of as being ruled over by their own patron deities. We see this referenced in a bunch of different ways. For example, in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, it says that the Most High divided up the peoples according to the number of the Bnei Elohim, or children of God. And Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob his share of the inheritance. Israel's frequently referred to as the inheritance of Yahweh throughout the Bible. So within this tradition, he is the patron deity of the people and the land of Israel, and his sovereignty ends at the borders of Israel. We see this, for example, in the story of the Syrian general Naaman, who comes down to be healed in the Jordan River, and wanting to now continue to worship Yahweh after returning to Syria. How does he worship a deity who can only be worshipped on Israelite soil? Easy, he takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil with him back to Syria. So as you can see, this idea of omnipotence only developed after at least a large chunk of the Bible had already been well established and passed around for centuries.
Huh. This sounds to me like the Bible doesn't deny the existence of other gods. Wasn't there that whole commandment about there not being any gods besides, the big guy?
Yeah, this I think brings us to the divine council. This is not really something I think most people or even Christians know about really, but the idea is that basically you have this council of gods ruled over by the high deity. And we see this in the Ugaritic literature, for example, which are pre-biblical texts that found pretty widespread appeal and recognition later on too. And in these texts, the gods are referred to as the 70 children of Asherah, and as the children of the god El. And we have very similar statements in the Hebrew Bible, in Psalm 82, for example, where the authors talk about Yahweh, the God of the Bible, standing before the Edat El, is what it's called in Hebrew, the Council of El. So we have this text in the Bible very closely resembling the Ugaritic literature. And in short, the authors of both of these texts understood the world to be governed by patron deities that each had sovereignty over their own nation, while being organized within this hierarchy of the divine council ruled over by Elyon, or the Most High, as they are referred to in Deuteronomy 32:8. This is essentially the divine patriarch that sat on his throne exercising his dominion over the other gods. And in that text, which is a very early manuscript, Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, Elyon is actually distinct from Yahweh. Here, the God of the Bible is just one of the Bnei Elohim, one of the children of God. But elsewhere in the Bible, we see Yahweh, who is in that position of the Most High. So the ruler over the divine council. We start seeing references to the council of Yahweh instead of the council of El, in, for example, Jeremiah 23:18 or Isaiah 6 or or 1 Kings 22, I think.
And is there a story about how El loses that position, or is it more so that those two identities just sort of merged over time, like slowly becoming the same guy?
From my research, I would say that the data would suggest the second option, that they merge. Probably between 1300 to 900 BCE, though there's some debate going on about when and how exactly that happened. You have Yahweh sort of coming in as the second tier deity, when you probably had a king or ruler rising to the throne around that time that was a follower or devotee of Yahweh, and doesn't really want to have competition between these two figures, Yahweh and El. Where everyone before him was more of a fan of El. So there would have probably been a public campaign of conflating these two identities that eventually resulted in Yahweh not only taking over El's rule over the pantheon, but also his consort, his wife Asherah, which is why we see these descriptions and depictions that I mentioned earlier that show them together. And this reconceptualization of the divine council goes on over time, where once we get to the Greco-Roman period, while there are still these secondary deities ruling over their respective nations, but they get renegotiated, reimagined, and changed from gods into angels. So you have a tradition arising in the Greco-Roman period. So in the book of Daniel, for example, where every nation now has their guardian angel, with the archangel Michael now watching over Israel, while God's sovereignty is extended across all nations under this new and approved divine council. So post-exile, and once you get into the New Testament, you still have some references to these other gods and this idea of a divine council, but as a means of retaining access to the worship of the God of Israel while exiled from the Holy Land, God's reach is extended and lifted above the rest of the divine council by sort of demoting or pushing down the other gods down to the status of angels, or sometimes demons, depending on the text you're reading.
All right. Now that we've talked about the different ways our conceptualizations of God and divine creatures evolve over time, what do you think causes these changes?
That question alone could probably fill an episode of its own, to be honest, but I'll try my best. To me, it's most useful to approach this question of how we read the Bible and how we interact with tradition, with stories in general, from a constructivist perspective. That is to say, that we should recognize that meaning as such is never inherent to the text we're reading, but that it is always created within the mind of the reader. Sounds a bit overly academic, maybe, but I think with an example we can understand this a bit better. So take a white flag, for example. A story mentioning someone waving a white flag might mean something very different to a race car driver than it would to a soldier. While to one of them, That paragraph might be talking about capitulation, to the other could be talking about the last lap of a race. This example is obviously a bit silly and a bit out there, but we see similar things happening all over the Bible too. And if you were raised hearing stories of the serpent in the Garden of Eden tempting Adam and Eve into eating the forbidden fruit, especially with the later traditions that identified that serpent as the devil or Satan, you may read other passages of the Bible, like Revelation 12:9, that refer to an ancient serpent identified as the devil being thrown down from heaven, as if they were talking about the snake in the garden. What else could they be talking about, right? In reality, however, most scholars agree now that this passage is actually referencing a much older story of the dragon Leviathan that is described in pretty much the same wording. The identification of the serpent in the Garden of Eden with Satan is really a much later invention and is not represented anywhere in the text of the Bible. But because we don't hear or just aren't exposed to these older stories of Leviathan, because we've maybe watched movies or heard our pastor talk about the devil tempting Eve with an apple, the intended meaning of this passage is lost or misinterpreted. So the meaning we assign to any given story in the Bible is based on certain cognitive biases that we've acquired over our lifetime. And as we saw in our discussion of the two creation accounts in Genesis, or the extent of God's sovereignty over the nations, what ideas, what traditions take precedent over others, what traditions are favored and carried on, is often dependent on the circumstances of the audience. So the exile of the Israelites, the cutting off of their access to certain religious institutions, for example, made it necessary to negotiate with the text. It changed the meaning of the text for the audience. I think if we recognize this reality and in our reading of Scripture try to engage with the text on its own terms without imposing our own views and preconceived notions of what it ought to say, we'll find that these texts hold so much more information, so much more nuance that would otherwise just be lost. And I think that would just be a shame. And, if not for reasons of faith and belief, then simply because nowhere else, at least to my knowledge, is there a textual cultural artifact that is so rich in perspectives, that has been passed down, changed, and reimagined by so many people over such a long time. And that reality is what I find so fascinating about this field of study, and hopefully I've managed to communicate and share at least some of that fascination with our listeners today.
Well, Tristan, once again, I really appreciate you coming on tonight and sharing some insights from your research. I look forward to doing this again sometime. For now, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Until next time on the Holy Smokes podcast.